So recently I purchased the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II to complement my ZV-E1 because sometimes I need two cameras for these YouTube videos. And today I want to share with you my settings for this new camera and more specifically how I use and expose S-Log3 to get the best image quality possible from this little camera. So first of all, in here, image quality file format, I'm using the XAVC S4K file format. I'm not using the SI4K file format because it takes up too much space. And I'm not using the HS file format because it only supports NTSC frame rates like 24, 30, 60, and 120p. And personally, I use PAL frame rates like 25, 15, and 100p. Next, in the movie settings in here, my base frame rate is 25 frames per second. But if I need slow motion, I'll switch it to 50p. And if I need extreme slow motion, I'll switch it to 100p. But I don't really use often the 100p option because it has a crop of about 1.5x on an already cropped camera, basically. And in the record setting in here, I use the highest option possible in all frame rates. So 140 megabits per second, 4:2 10-bit for 25p. And for 50p, 200 megabits per second. And for 100p, I use 280 megabits per second, 4:2 10-bit. Moving on, I turn on the log shooting option in here, because this basically allows me to import a custom LUT and use it as a preview LUT with the monitor of the camera. In the color gamut section, I use S-Log3 as gamut3.cine and I disable the embed LUT file because I don't want the camera to bake in the LUT to my footage. I prefer to have that flexibility in DaVinci Resolve. Now the LUT that I use, if I go in here, exposure color/tone, select LUT. I'm using the Alistair Chapman V3 S-Log3 LUT, which is completely free. Link is going to be down below. And what this LUT basically does is it compensates for overexposed S-Log3 footage. Basically, I always overexpose my S-Log3 footage to get the cleanest shadows possible. And usually when you do that with Sony cameras, it's going to look very bright on the display. But with this LUT, it basically compensates for overexposed S-Log3 footage. And it's a very, major tool that I use on all of my Sony cameras to get proper exposure when using S-Log3 because it makes the image look normal on the screen like it would look later on when correcting the exposure in DaVinci Resolve. Again, it's completely free, and later on in the video I'm going to show exactly how I use it in real life scenarios to get properly exposed, if you will, S-Log3 footage in different lighting conditions and scenarios. But a couple of things to consider with this is that first of all, you will need to go in here, display option, display LUT, and turn it on because otherwise you're not going to see the LUT on the screen. And also if you use an external monitor and then you're gonna go in here, external output, HDMI output settings, you're going to be limited to 1080p and not 4K. For whatever reason, Sony cameras do not allow to use log shooting option and output a 4K image to an external monitor, basically at least the ZV-E1 and this ZV-E10 Mark II. And another thing to consider is that when you do use the log shooting option with an external monitor, it will transmit the LUT to the monitor. For me personally, it's kind of a plus because I don't need to import a LUT to the monitor, but maybe you don't want to see that, so you'll have to disable the LUT option on the camera itself, but then you're not going to see the LUT in here and also in here unless you're going to import a LUT to the monitor. All right, now before I go outside and show you some examples, let me show you a final exposure setting in here, which is ISO. I only use the base ISOs of this camera, which are 800 for the low base ISO, and then 2500 for the high base ISO. So for daylight and most conditions, honestly, I use ISO 800. And for low light or when I'm shooting with a high f-stop like f10, for example, in a somewhat darker environment, I would use ISO 2500. Sometimes I do go higher if I need to when filming in low light, for example, but I try to stay either in 2500 or 800 to maintain the widest dynamic range this camera can offer, basically. Now, one thing that I forgot to mention is that I would highly recommend setting the display brightness on the camera as bright as possible to make it as easy as possible exposing your S-Log3 footage in bright conditions. So by default, this is the display brightness you'll get from this camera. And I'm not really sure if you can see, but even though it is not really bright outside at the moment, I can barely see anything on the display. So because of this, I would highly recommend going to the menu settings, setup page, monitor brightness, and switching it in here from manual to sunny weather. And as you can see right now, the screen is significantly brighter than before. It will consume more battery, but I think it's well worth it because it's going to make it significantly easier to properly expose your S-Log3 footage in bright conditions. Alternatively, you can invest in an external monitor like this. This is the Feelworld P6XL monitor, which Feelworld kindly sent me for free in exchange of integrating it into this video. It has a built-in rechargeable battery, which would last for about 2 hours at 100% brightness. It has a 6-inch screen, which is going to make it significantly easier to properly compose, expose, and check focus at the same time. It has all the necessary tools to properly expose pretty much any camera profile out there. And most importantly, it is significantly brighter at 1200 nits compared to something like this, which is going to make it again significantly easier exposing your S-Log3 footage in bright conditions. Now, the way I expose S-Log3 is actually pretty simple. I expose as bright as possible without clipping necessary information in the highlights. And the reason I do this is to keep the shadows as clean as possible, basically, because noise usually lives in the shadows, and when you're going to artificially brighten up the image in camera, basically raise the exposure in the shadows and then bring down the exposure in post-production, you're gonna get less noise. Now, the tools that I use to check if I'm properly exposed when shooting in S-Log3 are pretty simple. I use the zebras, and I also use the display with the LUT that I've shown you before. So I use zebras to check skin and highlight exposure, and then I verify with my eyes by looking at the display with the LUT that I've shown you before, basically the Alistair Chapman LUT. So the two zebra settings that I use are 75% zebras for skin. When I expose for skin, I use 75%. And then if I expose for highlights, I will use 95%. Basically, that's the clipping point of S-Log3. And highlights are sky, white sky, for example, white car in the background, something white in the background, like a building or something like this. Basically, something extremely bright in the scene. But something to keep in mind if you're going to use a different LUT than mine is that the camera calculates the zebras on top of the LUT, not beneath the LUT. So if I'm gonna go in here to the lower limit section, as you can see, the clipping point is 92 plus, because at 93, the zebras completely disappear. But if I'm gonna go back to the log shooting setting in here and disable this, and I'm gonna turn on the zebras again, lower limit, 92 plus, zebras still show up, 93 plus, zebras still there. At 94, they're still there as well. And at 95, they disappear, meaning the clipping point changed from 92 plus to 94 plus. So if you are going to use a different LUT than mine, maybe the clipping point is going to be at like 96, or maybe it's going to be at like 90. So please check this before shooting with your LUT to get the, the most accurate results, if you will. Now, I've enabled again the LUT, and I just want to mention something. I'm not really sure what's the difference between 92 plus in here and 95. I'm not really sure why in here it's clipping at 92 and in here it's clipping at 95. If you know, let us know down below. But the reason I'm using 95 in here is because it is much closer to 75. So when I'm like switching exposure from like skin and highlights basically in the background, I would quickly go from here 75 to like 95, 75, and then 95. Now, if I'm using the monitor, I would pretty much do the same thing. I would enable the zebras, and then 75% zebras is going to be for my skin, and 92% zebras, because at 93 they disappear, is going to be for the highlights, basically. But honestly, using false colors with a monitor is going to be significantly easier than using zebras. So let me show you how that looks like. So I'm going to enable the false colors, and I highly recommend using the ARRI false colors because they are easier to use in my personal opinion. So basically everything that's red here on the screen is completely overexposed. So if I want to expose for the sky, for the background, for example, I would reduce the exposure until the red and yellow colors disappear. So I would say somewhere around here. Now I'm properly exposed. Also, I can disable the false colors, check on the monitor if it looks correct to my eyes on both monitors, on the camera and also on the external monitor. And it does look correct to my eyes, even though the metering in here is blinking. I don't really look at the metering, I just look at the screen. It looks correct. Let me enable again false colors. Nothing shows like yellow colors and red colors. So everything is correctly exposed. And I can take the shot basically. And probably right now you can see the shot is extremely bright, but I can reduce the exposure and it's gonna look correct without any noise in here. You won't see any noise here in the shadows. It's gonna look extremely clean because I basically exposed my footage brighter than necessary right now. And then in post-production, I bring down the exposure, and basically that will reduce the noise in the shadows. Now let me switch to 75%, which is how I expose for skin. I'm gonna put my hand in here to keep it as simple as possible. And let me just open up the ND. It is still not bright enough, so because of this, I'm gonna switch to the second base ISO of 2500 because I'm lazy to take off the ND. So right now you can clearly see zebras on my hand. This is too overexposed. I would usually go in here as a starting point, and then I would bring down the exposure until the zebras disappear from the brightest part of my skin, basically in this case, my hand. I'm gonna use the shutter in here to make it a bit easier because it's hard to reach for the ND, but I would highly recommend using the ND for this instead of like, you know, playing with the shutter. So let me reduce the exposure. This is still too bright, and somewhere around here looks good to me. As you can see again, the metering is blinking like crazy, but I know for a fact this is proper skin exposure. If I was like shooting a video in here of myself, this is exactly how I would expose for my skin. And now if I would use false colors on the monitor, I would expose until most of my skin is like pinkish gray color, most of the brightest part of my skin, if you will. So this is still too bright, still too bright, still too bright. Somewhere around here looks good. As you can see, I have like in the middle of my hand lots of pink colors and like grayish colors, and on the other side it's like green colors. Of course, the background is completely blown out, it's completely overexposed, but I don't really care about this because I am exposing, at the moment at least, for my skin. This monitor, by the way, also has like waveform tools, so you can use that, but I don't find it to be as accurate as using false colors. And also you can enable all of the checker tools in here, like RGB parade, you have a vector scope, you also have a waveform. You can kind of look at the waveform, and maybe if I had to guess, somewhere around here looks good to me in terms of like exposure when looking at the waveform. But I think using the false colors in here is the most accurate way because you can clearly see the red and yellow colors when you are, you know, too exposed to the right. All right, another example I want to show you is when the light is pretty much flat and even. In those scenarios, I only use the display to judge exposure. I don't use zebras unless I'm going to expose for skin or there's something bright in the background, like let's say skies when shooting like a landscape scene. But when there's no highlights, there's no like a subject, like a person that I'm filming, I'm just going to use basically the display. I'm going to raise the exposure until it looks somewhat correct on the built-in display, or if I'm using an external monitor, then the external monitor. So for example, at the moment, let me just press record. This looks extremely dark to my eyes. It looks pretty dark in here and also in here. So I'm going to raise the exposure until it looks correct to my eyes, which is somewhere around here, right? And I'm using again shutter speed because it is a bit more convenient than flipping the ND, but I would highly recommend using the ND to maintain the 180-degree shutter roll. So basically in conditions like this, as you can see, the light is pretty flat and boring. There's no like highlights in here. I don't have a person in here standing. So in these conditions, I would highly recommend just using the display. If it looks correct on the display with the Alistair Chapman LUT, then it's going to be just fine. All right, let me show you some more real world examples. First, I'm going to expose for my skin in here. So I'm going to turn on the zebras. They're set to 75%. They're on at the moment. And also I'm going to enable the false colors on the monitor, right? And obviously at the moment, this is too dark. I'm going to raise the exposure until I see on the false colors that most of my skin is like pinkish gray, which is about here. And then also on the camera monitor, if I don't see zebras on my skin, I'm good. Let me just increase the exposure more. As you can see, this is too bright. Let me go down. Like 1/60 looks correct. And this is how it looks like in DaVinci Resolve without, you know, adjusting the exposure. And now here is how it looks with the exposure adjusted. As you can see, you know, the shot looks fantastic. Now, if I was exposing for the background, I would switch the zebras to 95% and then basically decrease the exposure until the zebras disappear. Or also if I use the external monitor, I would decrease the exposure until the red and yellow colors disappear. So somewhere around here looks fantastic, right? This is how it looks like. And now let me adjust the exposure. This is with the exposure adjusted in DaVinci Resolve, as you can see. It looks fantastic. Right, and finally, let me share with you how I adjust exposure in post-production for overexposed S-Log3 shots. I'm going to use my power grade that I sell for $10. If you want to support this channel, I'm going to leave a link for it down below. But otherwise, you can just pause the video, copy the nodes, and do basically the same thing I am going to show you right now. So let me apply this power grade to this shot in here. And first of all, here are my project settings. I'm using DaVinci with Gamut Intermediate and Rec 709 Scene as my output color space. And then here in the IDT, I'm going to put the camera settings, which are S-Log3 as Gamut 3 Cine. So this is S-Log3 as Gamut 3 Cine. And as you can see, it looks pretty much awful. It looks overexposed, if you will. But I am gonna go in here to this exposure node and then go to the HDR wheels and just reduce the exposure by about 2 stops, something like this. And now, as you can see, it looks normal, right? I exposed here for my skin, not for the background. I exposed for my skin, and my skin in terms of like exposure looks normal. It is a bit warm, so I'm gonna go to the white balance in here, white balance node, and I'm gonna reduce the red a bit, increase the blue just to make the skin a bit normal. And maybe we can apply the vignetting node just to add the vignette in here. Also isolator node just to isolate myself from the background. And again, this is all part of my power grade, by the way. And now it looks normal. So before it was like this, right? It was completely overexposed. Actually, I should disable this node. As you can see, it was like this, but then I brought down the exposure in post-production and there's no noise here in the shadows. Look how clean everything looks in here in the shadows. No noise at all. I don't need to apply any noise reduction. Looks beautiful, looks clean. And my skin looks correctly exposed. Nothing is like, you know, blown out or anything like that. Again, like I said, the background is blown out, but I exposed here for my skin, not for the background. Let me show you an example where I exposed for the highlights. Again, I'm going to start from scratch with my Roma power grade. And then I'm going to go to the IDT, set it to Gamut 3 Cine, S-Log3. Again, looks awful. I'm gonna go to the exposure node and just reduce the exposure in here until it looks normal, right? This is about 2 stops. Like I said before, I usually overexpose by about 2 stops, more or less. So something like this looks normal to me, right? It's a bit too blue, so I can play with the white balance, just warm it up a little bit and maybe reduce the green, play around with the reds, something like this. This looks good to me. This is I am out of focus, but in terms of noise, and I'm pixel peeping here, there is some noise in here, but if I expose this properly, according like to Sony's guidelines, I would have gotten so much noise here in the shadows. It would have been so distracting compared to this minimal amount of noise. So that's, again, the main reason why I expose my S-Log3 footage to the right, to keep the shadows as clean as possible, because you're basically, you know, brightening up the shadows in camera when you expose your S-Log3 footage in the field, and then in post-production, you bring it down and you're basically compressing the noise, you know, reducing the noise in after the fact in DaVinci itself. And then here is another shot I shot with the ZV-E10 Mark II, same lens and same settings pretty much. Let me apply the grade in here, and as you can see, it looks fantastic. It's a bit too dark actually. I'm gonna increase the exposure, and maybe it's too red. Just gonna fix the white balance quickly. Right, remove the red, something like so, and maybe actually increase the exposure even further. Here I didn't overexpose too much because I wanted to preserve some of the highlights on the left. But as you can see, even when you overexpose by about 1.5 stops or like 1 stop, if I'm really like pixel peeping, there is some noise. I can really see some, you know, noise in here. But again, if I would have exposed it properly, it would have been much more worse than this. Let me show you another example. This was shot about 2 weeks ago during a trip I did. Looks fantastic, beautiful and clean, ready to be published. And finally, let's check out this shot. Boom, cinema. Looks beautiful. Let me just adjust the white balance. It's a bit red. Just gonna increase the warmth in here. Look how beautiful it is. And I exposed here for the sky. This is how it looked like before. As you can see, too bright. I exposed for the sky. Looks fantastic. All right, so to summarize, hopefully I did not bore you to death with all of these terms, settings, numbers, and whatnot. I try to keep it as simple as possible, but it was pretty hard to film the screen of the camera and the screen of the monitor with the Pocket 3. But basically what you have to remember is that when you expose for highlights, use 95% zebras. on the camera or 92% zebras on the monitor. And then when you expose for skin, for like white skin like mine, it's like 75% zebras. And in both cases, highlights and skin, you reduce the exposure until the zebras disappear either from the skin, from the brightest part of the skin, or the sky. If you use a monitor like this, which I would highly recommend if you want to really practice, then using false colors is going to be the most logical way to go because it is far more accurate than zebras and it is quicker to use than something like zebras. But yeah, regardless, I'm going to leave a link down below for this Feelworld monitor. It is fantastic. It has like a built-in battery. You don't need to have to use NPF batteries for this. Link is going to be down below. And also, if you want to support this channel, I'm going to leave my power grade down below at the same time. It's only $10 and it works with pretty much any camera out there as long as you can convert the camera profile to DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, but you will need the studio version of Resolve for it to work because it's based basically on Filmworld Creator, which works only with the studio version of Resolve. All right, hopefully again, this video was useful. Thank you for watching, and I guess I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.